In 2012, investigators responding to a welfare check in rural New South Wales discovered something that would fundamentally challenge everything authorities thought they knew about family structures in modern Australia. What they found wasn't just neglect, it was evidence of a multi-generational family system operating completely outside social norms, where the very concept of distinct family relationships had ceased to exist. Before we dive into the story, if you're fascinated by cases that expose the darkest corners of human existence, cases that make us question how such things can happen in our modern world, then this channel is for you. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's see who's watching from the furthest time zone. Comment your location and time. Now let's continue with the story. The morning of August 14, 2012, began as routine for the child protection officers driving along the deteriorating dirt road toward the Burrowa region. Sarah Hemsworth and Michael Garrett had made similar welfare checks dozens of times throughout their careers. Rural properties often raised concerns. Isolation bred neglect. But nothing in their training prepared them for what awaited at the end of that 40-kilometer journey from the nearest town. The property appeared suddenly through dense bushland, a collection of structures that barely qualified as shelter. Makeshift tents sagged between rusted vehicles. Crude lean-tos constructed from corrugated iron and timber remnants dotted the clearing. The smell hit first, an overwhelming combination of human waste, rotting garbage, and something else they couldn't immediately identify. No power lines connected to the property, no visible water source beyond a murky dam. This wasn't poverty. This was something far more deliberate. Children emerged from the shadows as the officers stepped from their vehicle. Hemsworth counted at least 8, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all displaying similar features: unusual facial structures, eyes set too far apart, mouths that seemed unable to close properly. Their clothing hung in filthy tatters. Several were barefoot despite the winter cold. When Garrett attempted to speak with them, asking simple questions about their names and ages, the responses came in sounds that resembled language but conveyed no meaning he could comprehend. The children communicated among themselves in guttural utterances, a linguistic system entirely their own. An adult woman approached, her hostility immediate and visceral. She identified herself only as Betty, refusing to provide a surname or any documentation. When asked about the children's parentage, her answers became circular and contradictory. This child belonged to her sister, that one to her brother, another to someone else who wasn't present. The relationships made no logical sense. Hemsworth attempted to examine one child who appeared malnourished and noticed the girl couldn't walk without a pronounced limp. When pressed about medical care, Betty became aggressive, insisting they needed nothing from outside authorities. The officers retreated to their vehicle, disturbed by what they'd witnessed, but uncertain of the full scope. Standard protocols required documentation, consultation with supervisors, possibly a return visit with additional support. Neither could have imagined that this initial encounter had just exposed what would be documented as one of the most disturbing cases of systematic inbreeding in Australian history. The investigation that would follow would reveal secrets stretching back generations. A family that had deliberately isolated itself to maintain practices that defied every moral and legal boundary of contemporary society. Within 72 hours of that initial visit, Sarah Hemsworth returned to the property with a team of 6 additional officers, 2 police constables, and a court order authorizing immediate removal of all minors. What they documented during that intervention would require the expertise of forensic genealogists to fully comprehend. The family structure defied conventional mapping. 4 adult siblings also occupied the property. Betty, who they'd met previously, along with her brothers, Charlie and Dwayne, and another sister named Martha. Initial questioning suggested 12 children lived among them, though the adults proved evasive about exact numbers and ages. More troubling was their inability or unwillingness to identify which children belonged to whom. Betty claimed 3 children as hers, but couldn't name their father. Charlie insisted he had no children, then later mentioned 2 sons. Martha remained silent throughout, communicating only through hostile glares. Detective Inspector Paul Granger, assigned to coordinate the investigation, recognized immediately that standard interview protocols were insufficient. The children removed from the property ranged from 5 to 17 years old, yet none possessed birth certificates, vaccination records, or any documentation proving their existence. When asked to provide their full names, most could offer only single syllables or nicknames. Bluey was what the others called one boy of about 13. A girl of perhaps 10 responded only to Kip. These weren't affectionate childhood monikers. These were the only identities they'd ever known. The Department of Community Services initiated emergency DNA testing within 48 hours of removal. Standard procedure in complex custody cases. The results that returned 3 weeks later sent the investigation into entirely new territory. The lead geneticist, Dr. Rhonda Salzberg, requested an urgent meeting with senior investigators. What she presented in that closed-door session fundamentally altered the nature of the case. Nearly every child tested showed genetic markers indicating their parents were closely related, not distant cousins, siblings, or parent and child. The DNA evidence revealed something Dr. Salzberg had never encountered in 26 years of forensic genetics: a family tree that had collapsed into a closed loop. Traditional genealogical relationships no longer applied. Children who appeared to be siblings also showed genetic indicators of being uncle and niece. Others displayed markers suggesting their parents were themselves products of incestuous unions. Dr. Salzberg's report contained a phrase that would be repeated throughout subsequent legal proceedings: multi-generational consanguinity of the highest degree. The family had been operating as a closed genetic pool, not just for years, but for decades. Each generation had bred exclusively within itself, compounding genetic damage with mathematical precision. The likelihood of such patterns emerging accidentally was essentially zero. This was deliberate, systematic, a family that had intentionally maintained incestuous relationships across multiple generations. Granger ordered expanded testing, including the 4 adults. When those results arrived, the full horror crystallized. Betty and Charlie were both parents and siblings to several of the children. Dwayne's DNA indicated he was simultaneously brother, father, and uncle to different children in the group. Martha's genetic profile suggested her own parents had been closely related. The implications were staggering. This family structure hadn't begun with the current adults. It had been passed down to them, a multi-generational pattern of inbreeding that stretched backward in time further than anyone had yet traced. Court-appointed psychologists began preliminary assessments of the removed children, and their findings compounded the biological nightmare with developmental catastrophe. 10 of the 12 children showed significant intellectual impairment. 8 had never learned to read. 5 couldn't count beyond 10. The oldest, a 17-year-old girl they'd begun calling Ruth, possessed the cognitive capacity of a 7-year-old. She'd never attended school, never seen a television, never traveled beyond the property boundaries. When asked about her parents, she pointed to both Charlie and Betty, unable to understand why the question confused her questioners. The physical examinations revealed additional horrors. 6 children suffered from hearing impairments ranging from moderate to severe. 4 had vision problems requiring immediate intervention. 3 displayed skeletal abnormalities consistent with rickets and malnutrition. Every single child bore scars from untreated injuries and infections. 1 boy's leg had healed crooked after a break that never received medical attention. A girl of about 8 had teeth rotted to brown stumps. But perhaps most disturbing was the language barrier. Linguistic experts brought in to assess the children's communication patterns determined they'd developed a primitive shared language, a rudimentary system of grunts, gestures, and invented words, comprehensible only among themselves. They could understand some standard English, but responded primarily in their created dialect. Decades of isolation had produced children who were linguistically, socially, and genetically distinct from the broader Australian population. They were, in effect, a separate community that existed hidden within a modern nation. The medical assessments conducted at Sydney Children's Hospital between September and November of 2012 documented consequences that geneticists had previously observed only in laboratory studies of severely inbred animal populations. Dr. Patricia Newcomb, the pediatrician coordinating examinations, compiled a report that would become sealed evidence in subsequent court proceedings, its contents too disturbing for public consumption. The physical manifestations varied among the children, but followed recognizable patterns. Cranial measurements revealed abnormalities in 8 of the 12. Their skulls displayed either unusually narrow or disproportionately wide structures, creating the distinctive facial features Hemsworth had noticed during that first encounter. These weren't cosmetic concerns. Brain imaging showed that 3 children had reduced cranial capacity, physically limiting cognitive development before birth. Ruth, the 17-year-old, underwent the most comprehensive evaluation. Neurological testing revealed she possessed an IQ of 54, placing her in the range of moderate intellectual disability. More troubling was the discovery that her condition likely resulted not from any single genetic defect, but from the accumulated burden of multiple recessive genes expressing themselves simultaneously. Her parents' close relationship had given harmful genetic variants no opportunity to be magged by healthier alternatives. She'd inherited duplicate copies of damaged genes from both sides, each reinforcing the other's destructive effects. The younger children presented even grimmer prognoses. A boy they'd named Timothy, approximately 9 years old, was functionally deaf in both ears. Audiological testing suggested his condition stemmed from malformed inner ear structures, a rare congenital defect that medical literature associated with consanguineous reproduction. He'd never received hearing aids, never learned sign language, never been given any tool to navigate his silent world. His isolation within isolation had left him nearly unreachable. 2 sisters, estimated at 11 and 13, both required emergency dental surgery. Their teeth had erupted in chaotic patterns, overlapping and misaligned in ways that prevented proper chewing. Untreated cavities had progressed to abscesses. The elder sister's infection had spread to her jawbone, requiring partial removal of necrotic tissue. The dentist's report noted that their dental structure suggested a genetic predisposition to enamel defects, likely homozygous expression of genes that should have remained recessive. Kip, the 10-year-old girl, presented with severe scoliosis, her spine curved at a 38-degree angle. Orthopedic specialists determined that early intervention during childhood could have prevented the deformity from becoming permanent. Instead, She'd grown into adolescence, with her body literally twisting itself out of proper alignment. Corrective surgery might offer some improvement, but she would carry physical consequences of neglect for the remainder of her life. The psychological evaluations proved equally devastating. Dr. Hammond Priest, a child psychiatrist with 3 decades of experience, found himself confronting behaviors he'd never previously encountered. Several children displayed what he termed profound social incomprehension. They understood affection only in contexts that violated fundamental taboos. When foster families attempted normal parental gestures, the children responded with confusion or inappropriate sexual behavior. They'd been conditioned to view incestuous contact as normal familial interaction. Bluey, the 13-year-old boy, exhibited violent outbursts when separated from his siblings. His attachment patterns suggested he'd been taught to view the family unit as the only safe entity in an otherwise hostile world. Attempts to integrate him into group therapy with other children in care failed catastrophically when he attacked a boy who sat too close to one of his sisters. His protective aggression stemmed not from healthy sibling bonds, but from something far more disturbing. He'd been raised to guard family property from outsiders. The speech pathologist assigned to work with the children, Elena Vasquez, spent 2 months attempting to decode their communication system. What she discovered was a language stripped to functional minimums. They possessed words for food, danger, and basic needs, but lacked vocabulary for abstract concepts like future, hope, or choice. Their linguistic development had frozen at a toddler level, never advancing, because no one in their environment spoke at higher complexity. They communicated like people who'd never needed to express anything beyond immediate survival requirements. Most chilling was the collective assessment's conclusion. The youngest children, those under 7, showed the most severe impairments. Each generation had suffered greater damage than the one before. The genetic burden was accelerating, compounding with each successive inbred union. Had authorities not intervened when they did, medical experts estimated that children born in the next generation would likely have suffered catastrophic birth defects, incompatible with survival. The family was, quite literally, breeding itself into genetic extinction. Detective Inspector Granger's investigation into the family's origins required piecing together fragments from 3 countries and 5 decades. The adults refused cooperation, offering only hostile silence or deliberate misinformation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired social worker in New Zealand who'd kept private notes about a troubling family she'd encountered in 1976. Margaret Sutton had been 24 years old when she conducted a home visit to a rural property outside Christchurch. The family name in her records was listed as Colt, though she noted even then that documentation seemed questionable. The patriarch, a man named Timothy Colt, lived with what he claimed were his wife, June, and their 5 children. But Sutton's observations contradicted the official story. June appeared far too young to be mother to the oldest children. The family's behavior suggested relationships that defied the neat categories on government forms. Sutton's notes, preserved in a personal file she'd maintained after retiring, described Timothy as controlling and paranoid. He'd refused to allow her inside the residence, conducting the entire interview on the porch while family members watched from windows. When she attempted to speak with the children individually, he interjected constantly, answering questions directed at them. The oldest daughter, approximately 15, displayed a pronounced deference toward her father that Sutton found disturbing. Her body language suggested fear rather than respect. The visit had troubled Sutton enough that she'd filed a follow-up report recommending continued monitoring. But when she returned 3 months later, the property stood empty. Neighbors reported the family had departed in the middle of the night, leaving no forwarding information. The case file was eventually closed due to lack of jurisdiction once the family had relocated. Sutton never learned what became of them, though the memory haunted her professional conscience for decades. Granger's team cross-referenced Sutton's descriptions with the adults in custody. Betty would have been that 15-year-old daughter. The timeline aligned precisely. Birth records obtained from New Zealand authorities confirmed that Timothy Colt had registered 5 children between 1961 and 1973. Betty, Charlie, Dwayne, Martha, and a 5th child named Frank, who appeared nowhere in current records. The mother listed on all certificates was June Colt, though hospital records showed June herself had been born in 1958, making her only 3 years old when the first child was supposedly born to her. The deception ran deeper. Further investigation revealed that June was actually Timothy's daughter from a previous relationship, though no documentation existed for that earlier union. Timothy had begun the pattern in an earlier generation, producing children with his own offspring, then raising those children to continue the cycle. June had disappeared from all records after 1974. Whether she'd died, escaped, or been hidden away remained unknown. Australian immigration records showed the Colt family entering the country in 1978, listing Western Australia as their intended destination. They'd presented as a family unit: Timothy, his 5 children, and 2 grandchildren, who were actually the products of incestuous relationships between Timothy and his daughter Betty. The immigration officers had noted nothing unusual. The family appeared poor, but within normal parameters for rural migrants seeking agricultural opportunities. Property records traced their movements across Australia like breadcrumbs, marking a deliberate retreat from civilization. They'd purchased 40 hectares outside Esperance in Western Australia, living there until 1985. Local school records showed sporadic attendance by several children during those years, never more than a few weeks at a time. Teachers who remembered them described kids who seemed frightened of interaction, who flinched at sudden movements, who spoke in fragments rather than complete sentences. In 1986, the family relocated to South Australia, acquiring isolated land in the Flinders Ranges. They remained there for nearly 15 years, their longest single residence. During this period, the children who would become the adults found on the Borowa property matured into adolescence and began producing their own offspring. The isolation intensified. No school records exist from this period, no medical visits, no interactions with government services of any kind. Timothy Colt died in 2001, according to a death certificate filed in South Australia. Cause of death listed as natural causes, certified by a rural doctor who'd been called to the property. The family buried him on their land without formal ceremony. His death should have ended the cycle. Instead, it merely removed the original architect, leaving his children to continue the pattern he'd established. They'd known no other way of life. The practices he'd imposed had become their normal, passed down like any other family tradition. Within months of Timothy's death, the family sold the South Australian property and moved to New South Wales, eventually settling on the Borowa land, where authorities would find them 11 years later. They were fleeing nothing specific, simply maintaining the nomadic pattern Timothy had established. Stay isolated, avoid scrutiny, Move before anyone looked too closely. The strategy had worked for more than 3 decades. The family's arrival in New South Wales followed a pattern perfected over decades. In March of 2002, they purchased the Boorowa property through a private sale that avoided conventional real estate channels. The seller, an elderly farmer named Gerald Hutchins, later told investigators he'd been relieved to offload land that had become too burdensome to maintain. He'd met with Charlie, who presented himself as the family spokesman, exactly once. Cash payment. No questions asked. Hutchins never visited the property after the transaction concluded. What made the New South Wales period particularly significant was the family's proximity to civilization compared to their previous locations. The property sat only 40 kilometers from Boorowa, a town of over 1,100 residents. Young, a larger regional center, lay 60 kilometers north. For the first time in their nomadic existence, the family lived within reasonable distance of schools, hospitals, and social services. Yet they made no use of these resources. Local residents recalled occasional sightings of family members in Young during the early years. A shopkeeper named Diane Prentice remembered a woman matching Martha's description purchasing bulk supplies: flour, sugar, cooking oil, always paying in cash, never engaging in conversation. The visits occurred approximately every 6 weeks, always the same pattern. Martha would arrive in a decrepit utility vehicle, load her purchases without assistance, and depart. She never brought children, never lingered, never returned if other customers were present. The family's self-sufficiency bordered on absolute. They generated no electricity bills because they used no electricity, no water bills because they relied on rainwater collection and the property's dam, no sewage services because they dug pit latrines. They hunted rabbits and kangaroos for meat, grew vegetables in poorly maintained garden plots, kept chickens that roamed freely, producing eggs that supplemented their meager diet. They'd created a closed system that required minimal external contact. But isolation came with costs. A neighboring property owner, Vincent Eldridge, whose land adjoined the Colt property's eastern boundary, reported hearing screams on multiple occasions between 2004 and 2008. He'd contacted police twice. Both times, officers conducted welfare checks that yielded nothing actionable. The family claimed someone had injured themselves accidentally. No evidence of immediate danger. No grounds for further intervention. The screams stopped being reported after 2008, though Eldridge later admitted he'd simply stopped calling, frustrated by the lack of response. School enrollment records told their own story of near misses. In 2006, someone enrolled 3 children at Boorowa Central School. The registration listed false birth dates and provided a disconnected phone number. The children attended for exactly 9 days before vanishing. Teachers remembered them as feral, unable to sit still, speaking in garbled sentences that other students mocked. One teacher, Judith Kramer, had begun documenting concerns when the children simply stopped appearing. Her reports went to the district office but triggered no follow-up because the family had provided no traceable address. A similar pattern occurred in 2009 at Young Public School. 2 children enrolled, attended sporadically for 3 weeks, then disappeared. The principal attempted home visits, but couldn't locate the property with the vague directions provided. The matter was referred to truancy officers, but the case was eventually closed when the family couldn't be found. No one connected these scattered enrollments to the same family. Different names, different ages, different schools. The deliberate obfuscation worked. Medical records proved even sparser. Emergency room visits at Young District Hospital showed 3 separate incidents between 2003 and 2011. A child with a broken arm, another with severe burns from a cooking fire, a third with infection from an untreated wound. Each time, an adult provided minimal information, refused follow-up appointments, and paid in cash. Hospital social workers flagged all 3 cases as concerning, but the family's mobility and false information prevented any coordinated response. The most damning evidence of systemic failure came from community services records. Between 2002 and 2012, 4 separate reports were filed expressing concern about children on the property. Anonymous calls from people who'd glimpsed kids in poor condition during the family's rare trips to town. Each report triggered an investigation. Each investigation concluded with the same result: unable to locate family or verify concerns. The reports sat in different district offices, never compiled into a single file that might have revealed the pattern. What nobody understood until after the 2012 intervention was that the family had refined their evasion tactics across 4 decades. They knew exactly how much contact to maintain to avoid triggering intensive scrutiny. Brief school enrollments satisfied mandatory education laws on paper. Rare medical visits demonstrated they weren't completely negligent. Scattered reports across multiple jurisdictions prevented any single agency from seeing the full picture. They'd learned to exploit the gaps in Australia's social safety net, the spaces between jurisdictions where families could disappear despite living in plain sight. The complete DNA analysis, finalized in November of 2012, required Dr. Salzberg to construct what she termed the most disturbing genealogical document of her career. Traditional family trees branch outward, each generation expanding the genetic pool. The Colt family tree collapsed inward, relationships folding back on themselves until the entire structure became a tangled knot of interconnected lines. The genetic mapping revealed that Timothy Colt had fathered children with his daughter Betty across 2 decades. Those children, Betty's siblings by blood and her offspring by biology, had then produced the next generation through unions among themselves. The genetic mapping confirmed Timothy Colt had fathered children with his daughter Betty across 2 decades. Those children had then produced the next generation through unions among themselves, creating relationships that defied conventional terminology. The terminology of family relationships simply failed to capture the reality. Ruth, the 17-year-old, presented perhaps the most complex case. DNA analysis showed her parents were Charlie and Betty, who were themselves both children of Timothy. This made Ruth simultaneously the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of Timothy. Her genetic profile showed an inbreeding coefficient of 0.375, a number that approached theoretical maximums. For comparison, siblings who produce children together create offspring with a coefficient of 0.25. Ruth's parents were more closely related than typical siblings. The younger children displayed even higher coefficients. A 6-year-old boy showed a coefficient of 0.42, suggesting his parents were themselves products of sibling unions who then reproduced together. The mathematical reality was staggering. More than 40% of his genetic code consisted of identical sequences inherited from both parents. In a healthy, genetically diverse individual, that number would be near 0. This level of genetic similarity existed nowhere in nature except in laboratory-created inbred animal lines, and even those were rarely sustained beyond a few generations due to catastrophic health failures. Dr. Salzberg's report contained a section analyzing what geneticists call runs of homozygosity, stretches of DNA where both copies of chromosomes are identical. In the general population, these runs account for perhaps 1% of the genome. In Timothy, they covered 11%. In Charlie and his siblings, 19%. In Ruth, 34%. In the youngest children, some exceeded 40%. Each generation had essentially photocopied larger sections of damaged genetic material, eliminating the diversity that normally masks harmful mutations. The practical consequences manifested in what Dr. Salzberg called genetic load, the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes. Every human carries lethal or severely harmful recessive mutations, typically 5 to 10 of them. In healthy populations, these remain hidden because individuals rarely inherit the same harmful mutation from both parents. But in the Colt family, harmful genes had nowhere to hide. The children inherited identical broken genes from both sides, expressing disorders that should be vanishingly rare. One child carried 2 copies of a gene variant associated with metabolic dysfunction. Another had duplicate mutations affecting kidney development. A third showed genetic markers for a degenerative neurological condition that would likely manifest in her 20s. These weren't isolated defects. Each child carried multiple compounding genetic problems, their bodies struggling under the weight of accumulated mutations that natural selection would have eliminated in a healthy breeding population. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of miscarriages and infant deaths. Forensic examination of the property uncovered remains of at least 3 infants buried in shallow graves. DNA testing of the remains showed even higher inbreeding coefficients than the surviving children, suggesting that the most severely affected offspring had died shortly after birth or in early infancy. The family had been experiencing what animal breeders call inbreeding depression, where each generation shows increased mortality, reduced fertility, and declining overall fitness. Dr. Salzberg's analysis concluded with a projection that chilled investigators. Based on the mathematical progression of inbreeding coefficients across 4 generations, she estimated that children born in another generation would have faced near-certain severe disabilities or death. The family was approaching what geneticists call an extinction vortex, where genetic diversity drops so low that the population can no longer sustain itself. The Colt family had been perhaps 1 generation away from complete genetic collapse. What made this particularly horrifying was the realization that someone had to have known. The pattern of infant deaths, the obvious physical problems in surviving children, the accumulating disabilities across generations, all pointed to a conscious choice to continue despite overwhelming evidence of harm. This wasn't ignorance. The family had maintained these practices deliberately, watching children suffer, burying dead infants, and still perpetuating unions that guaranteed more of the same. The genetic evidence revealed not just biological catastrophe, but a moral void that had persisted across half a century. The New South Wales Supreme Court proceedings that commenced in March of 2013 confronted legal challenges unprecedented in Australian jurisprudence. Justice Peter Biscoe, assigned to preside over the case, faced fundamental questions about how to prosecute crimes that had unfolded across multiple jurisdictions, involved victims who couldn't testify coherently, and challenged the very framework of existing legislation. The charges filed against the 4 adult siblings included incest, child neglect, and concealment of births. But constructing prosecutable cases from the genetic and testimonial evidence proved extraordinarily complex. Incest laws required proof of specific acts between identifiable individuals. The children couldn't provide such testimony. They lacked the cognitive capacity to understand court proceedings, couldn't reliably identify who had done what to whom, and displayed trauma responses that made questioning deeply problematic. Crown prosecutors instead built their case on documentary evidence. The DNA analysis provided irrefutable proof that incestuous relationships had produced the children. Medical records documented systematic neglect. Forensic evidence from the property, including the buried infant remains, established a pattern of concealment. The prosecution strategy focused on proving the adults had knowingly maintained an environment of abuse rather than prosecuting individual acts. Betty became the first to face trial in July of 2013. Her defense attorney, Marcus Lewiston, attempted to argue that she was as much a victim as perpetrator, raised in an environment where incestuous relationships were normalized, lacking the education or opportunity to understand the harm being perpetrated. Psychiatric evaluations submitted to the court showed Betty possessed an IQ of 68, placing her in the range of mild intellectual disability. She'd never attended school beyond primary level. Her entire worldview had been shaped by Timothy's deliberately isolated system. The prosecution countered with evidence that Betty had actively participated in concealing the family's practices. She'd provided false information during school enrollments. She'd lied to medical professionals. She'd physically prevented children from interacting with outsiders during the rare occasions when authority figures visited the property. Whether she fully understood the moral dimensions of her actions became irrelevant when prosecutors demonstrated she'd understood enough to know that exposure would result in intervention. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of incest and child neglect. Justice Biscoe sentenced Betty to 10 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 5 years. In his sentencing remarks, he acknowledged the complexity of her position, but emphasized that protection of children superseded considerations of her own victimhood. The children in her care had suffered catastrophic harm that she'd actively worked to conceal. Charlie's trial followed in October. Unlike Betty, he showed no intellectual impairment. His IQ tested at 94, within normal range. He'd functioned as the family's primary liaison with the outside world, handling property transactions and supply purchases. The prosecution argued this demonstrated clear awareness that their lifestyle violated social norms. Charlie had deliberately structured the family's existence to avoid scrutiny, understanding full well what authorities would find if they looked too closely. His defense attempted to invoke cultural relativism, suggesting the family had developed its own isolated culture with different norms. This argument collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence that Charlie had explicitly instructed children to lie to teachers and social workers during the brief periods they'd attended school. He'd taught them to conceal their home situation, to provide false information about their family structure, to avoid answering questions about their parents. This wasn't cultural difference. It was conscious deception motivated by awareness of wrongdoing. The jury convicted Charlie on all charges. Justice Biscoe imposed a 15-year sentence with a non-parole period of 8 years, noting that Charlie's higher cognitive functioning and leadership role within the family structure warranted harsher punishment than Betty had received. Martha and Dwayne's cases proved more complicated. Martha had remained virtually silent throughout the investigation, refusing to speak with police, psychologists, or her own legal counsel. Psychiatric evaluation determined she was competent to stand trial, but suffering from severe psychological trauma that manifested as selective mutism. Her trial proceeded in her near-total silence, with evidence presented largely through documentation rather than testimony. Dwayne, meanwhile, had vanished. 3 weeks before his scheduled trial date in January of 2014, he failed to appear for a routine bail hearing. A warrant was issued, but he disappeared completely. Investigators theorized he'd fled to remote Queensland or possibly left Australia entirely using false documentation. As of 2015, he remained at large, the only adult family member to escape legal accountability. The court imposed strict suppression orders on all proceedings. Media could report that trials had occurred, but could not identify family members by name, describe the property's location beyond general regional designation, or publish photographs of any individuals involved. Justice Biscoe ruled that the children's right to anonymity superseded public interest in transparency. The cult pseudonym was assigned to protect their identities permanently. The forensic examination of the Burowa property, conducted over 3 months in late 2012, revealed the calculated architecture of isolation. Investigators documented not just squalor, but a deliberately constructed environment designed to prevent outside observation and maintain absolute family control. The property lacked any permanent structure that would meet building code standards. The main dwelling consisted of a corrugated iron shell with no insulation, no windows, and a dirt floor. Inside, investigators found sleeping areas separated only by hanging blankets, creating the illusion of privacy where none actually existed. The space could accommodate perhaps 6 people comfortably. 12 children and 4 adults had lived in this confined area, their proximity ensuring constant surveillance and eliminating any possibility of private space. 3 additional shelters dotted the property, constructed from salvaged materials and plastic sheeting. These served as overflow sleeping areas during warmer months, but offered no protection from winter cold. Forensic analysts noted that the arrangement prevented any child from being isolated from adult supervision. Every sleeping space remained visible from multiple vantage points. The layout functioned as an open prison, where freedom of movement existed only within carefully controlled boundaries. The absence of electricity took on sinister significance under scrutiny. Without power, the family had no telephone, no radio, no television. Children grew to adolescence without exposure to media depicting normal family structures, without hearing voices from beyond their immediate environment, without any reference point for comparison. The technological isolation was absolute and deliberate. Several generators sat unused in a storage shed, suggesting the family possessed means to generate electricity, but chose not to. Water collection systems showed similar calculation. The property had 3 large rainwater tanks capable of storing thousands of liters, yet investigators found them contaminated with debris and algae, the water unsafe for consumption. Instead, the family drew water directly from a stagnant dam where livestock also drank. This choice made no practical sense unless viewed as another tool of control. Contaminated water produced chronic low-level illness, keeping children weak and dependent, unable to build the physical strength that might enable escape or resistance. The pit latrines, dug at various locations around the property, had been placed deliberately close to living areas. The smell was overwhelming, attracting flies that swarmed constantly during warmer months. Health inspectors noted this violated basic sanitation principles that even impoverished rural families typically understood. The placement suggested intention rather than ignorance. Living in constant proximity to human waste normalized degradation, breaking down psychological boundaries that might otherwise exist. Food storage told its own story of deprivation as control mechanism. Investigators found minimal preserved food, despite the family's claims of self-sufficiency. Garden plots showed evidence of plantings, but poor maintenance that guaranteed meager yields. The chicken flock consisted of fewer than a dozen birds, insufficient to feed 16 people. Hunting equipment existed, but showed little use. The family appeared to have maintained perpetual near starvation, another factor ensuring weakness and dependence. Documents discovered in a locked metal box revealed the family's financial situation was far better than their living conditions suggested. Bank statements showed accounts containing over $40,000, accumulated through government benefits and payments received for seasonal agricultural labor. The money had been carefully hoarded rather than spent on improving living conditions. Charlie controlled all accounts, maintaining economic power that reinforced his authority within the family structure. Personal belongings of the children amounted to almost nothing. A few changes of clothing, all threadbare and filthy. No toys, no books, no personal items that might foster individual identity. Investigators found a single damaged radio that no longer functioned, its presence suggesting that at some point, perhaps years earlier, outside information had been accessible before being deliberately cut off. The property's location revealed final elements of the isolation strategy. Situated at the end of a 4-kilometer dirt track that branched off a seldom-traveled rural road, the property was effectively invisible to casual passers-by. Dense bushland obscured it from neighboring properties. The nearest residence sat 3 kilometers away, too distant for sounds to carry or for neighbors to observe daily activities. The family had achieved near-perfect physical isolation while remaining technically within reach of social services. Most disturbing were the modifications to the property's perimeter. Although no formal fence enclosed the area, investigators found that paths leading away from the central compound had been deliberately obstructed. Fallen trees left uncleared, blocked routes to neighboring properties. Thick undergrowth, allowed to grow unchecked, created natural barriers. The few clear paths led either to the dam or to the access road, both visible from the main dwelling. Children venturing in any other direction would face impenetrable scrub and would be immediately noticed as absent. Vincent Eldridge, the neighbor who'd reported screams, told investigators he'd once encountered 2 of the children who'd wandered onto his property. They'd fled when he approached, disappearing back into the bush with what he described as animal terror. He'd assumed they were simply shy rural children. The memory haunted him after learning the truth. The children's transition into foster care between 2012 and 2015 tested every assumption Australian Child Welfare Services held about rehabilitation and recovery. Dr. Priest coordinated a team of specialists who confronted challenges that existed nowhere in their training or literature. Ruth's placement failed within 6 weeks. Her foster family, experienced with traumatized children, found themselves overwhelmed by behaviors they couldn't comprehend. She became violently agitated when prevented from sleeping in the same room as her younger siblings. She hoarded food compulsively, hiding it in her clothing and under her bed until it rotted. Most disturbing, she made sexual advances toward the foster father, unable to understand why he recoiled. When social workers attempted to explain appropriate boundaries, she grew confused and distressed, interpreting their guidance as rejection. She was moved to a specialized group home with staff trained in severe developmental disabilities. Even there, progress proved glacial. After 3 years, she'd learned to dress herself independently and could communicate basic needs in simple English. But abstract concepts like privacy, personal ownership, or future planning remained beyond her grasp. Psychologists estimated she would require supervised care for the remainder of her life. The younger children showed marginal improvement. Timothy, the deaf 9-year-old, received cochlear implants that provided partial hearing restoration, but the neurological pathways for language processing had closed during his critical developmental years. Sign language instruction helped him communicate basic needs, yet he would never achieve fluency in any language. His foster placement remained stable, though his carers described him as emotionally flat, rarely showing joy or distress beyond immediate physical needs. The 2 sisters who'd required dental surgery were eventually adopted by a family in regional Victoria. Of all the children, they demonstrated the most capacity for integration, possibly because their genetic damage was less severe. By 2016, both attended specialized education programs and could interact with peers, though they remained years behind in social and academic development. Their adoptive parents reported they still occasionally lapsed into the invented language when stressed, retreating to the only communication system that felt truly native. Bluey's violent protective instincts never fully resolved. Multiple foster placements collapsed when he attacked other children or adults he perceived as threats to his siblings. By 2015, he'd been placed in a secure youth facility after seriously injuring another foster child during what staff described as an unprovoked assault. Psychiatric evaluation suggested he experienced persistent paranoid ideation, interpreting normal interactions as hostile. His prognosis remained poor, with specialists predicting likely transition to adult psychiatric facilities upon reaching 18. Kip, the girl with severe scoliosis, underwent corrective surgery that provided some physical improvement, but left her with chronic pain. Her foster placement stabilized after she was paired with a family that included a mother who was a former special education teacher. By 2016, she'd learned to read at a basic level and could perform simple arithmetic. Her emotional development lagged far behind, but she showed capacity for attachment that offered hope for eventual independent living with ongoing support. The youngest children, those under 7 at removal, demonstrated the paradox of their situation. Their severe genetic impairments created cognitive ceilings they would never surpass. Yet their younger age at intervention meant they'd formed fewer fixed patterns from their abusive environment. They would never be normal, but they might achieve stability within their limitations. By 2020, the legal proceedings had concluded, leaving behind questions more disturbing than answers. Betty completed her minimum sentence and was released under strict supervision orders prohibiting contact with any of the children. She relocated to a supervised housing facility in Western Sydney, her cognitive limitations requiring ongoing support. Charlie remained imprisoned, his earliest possible release date set for 2026. Martha received a 7-year sentence after finally speaking during her trial, offering a confession that revealed nothing investigators hadn't already documented. Dwayne was never found. The case forced systematic examination of how such extreme abuse persisted, undetected for generations. A government inquiry conducted in 2014 identified 43 separate instances where intervention might have prevented continuation of the family's practices. The scattered school enrollments, the emergency room visits, the neighbors' reports, the social workers' concerns in New Zealand decades earlier. Each represented a potential breaking point where proper follow-through might have saved children from suffering. The inquiry's findings were damning. Rural social services operated with insufficient resources and poor coordination between jurisdictions. Families who moved frequently could reset their interactions with authorities, preventing pattern recognition. Privacy laws sometimes prevented information sharing that might have revealed concerning trends. The inquiry made 17 recommendations, including mandatory cross-jurisdictional reporting systems and enhanced rural outreach programs. But beneath the bureaucratic failures lay more troubling questions about the nature of evil and culpability. Timothy Colt had initiated the cycle deliberately, yet he'd been shaped by whatever environment produced him. His children had perpetuated practices that damaged their own offspring, yet they'd known no alternative. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred across generations until it became almost indistinguishable. Prosecution had been necessary, but it couldn't address the fundamental horror of a family system that had consumed itself across half a century. Experts estimated the inbreeding had likely begun in the 1960s, possibly earlier if Timothy himself was a product of consanguineous relationships 4 or 5 generations had suffered, each worse than the last, accelerating toward genetic collapse that would have made further reproduction impossible. The family had been destroying itself with mathematical precision, and nobody had noticed until the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The children remain in care. Their identities protected, their futures uncertain. The youngest are now teenagers. Ruth is in her late 20s, her cognitive age frozen at 7. Some will require institutional support throughout their lives. Others might achieve limited independence. None will ever be truly normal. They carry in their bodies and minds the accumulated weight of decisions made decades before their births, victims of a family system that treated human beings as expendable components in a cycle of abuse that spanned continents and generations. The Burowa property was eventually sold, the structures demolished, the land returned to agricultural use. Nothing marks it as the site of one of Australia's most disturbing cases of systematic inbreeding. The only permanent record exists in sealed court documents and the damaged lives of 12 children who will spend the rest of their days recovering from childhoods that should never have been possible in a modern nation. If this story has shaken you, if it's made you realize how darkness can hide in plain sight, how systems meant to protect can fail so completely, then share this video. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because the most important stories are often the ones we'd prefer not to hear. The ones that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in and the children we fail to see.